wonderful information to get through today. So I want to welcome and thank you all for joining us today for our TTAC webinar on the power of our practice, addressing racism and systemic inequity through early childhood mental health consultation. We are really thrilled to be bringing this webinar to you today. My name is Meg Beyer. I am the Director of Healthcare Innovations at the McSilver Institute. I am one of the many TTAC partners, and again, I'm so happy to be joined by our presenter, Kadija, our partners from NYCCD, and all of you this afternoon. I also want to thank my colleague, Kevin, who is the McSilver host today, making sure that we're collecting all the questions that you'll send in and making sure all the logistics are running smoothly today. So speaking of logistics, a few things about today's webinar before our presenter begins. As we've done in the past, this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted along with the slides to the TTAC website, so you can look for that information and share that with your colleagues afterwards. We will be taking questions throughout the entire webinar today, and we ask that you chat in your questions using the chat box functionality that should be visible on the right-hand side of your WebEx screen, selecting all panelists on the drop-down where there's that little arrow pointing down. Please click that and select all panelists. We're setting time aside at the end of today's webinar to address these questions, but please do not hesitate to chat in your questions throughout the entire webinar. We find it's best to have a whole list of questions organized at the end to ask of our wonderful presenter, so please don't hesitate if a question pops up to go right ahead and ask it. For those LMSWs and LMHCs who are interested in obtaining CEUs for today's webinar, you will be eligible to receive an hour and a half, so that's 1.5 CEU credit hours for attending the webinar. If you've only joined by phone today, here's the caveat. We need you to log on to the WebEx via computer in order to confirm your attendance and obtain credit for the CEUs. So please, if you are looking to receive CEU credit, you cannot just dial in only via the phone. You also have to log in via the computer because you need to confirm your attendance via your email address as well. You can also dial in for audio, but we do need you to log in through your email link so that we can confirm your attendance in this. Further information and instruction on how to obtain your CEs, that will be distributed after the webinar in an email. And then finally, at the end of the webinar, we are going to be sending out a feedback survey through the chat box functionality. So the same place that you'll send in your questions, you will also receive a hyperlink that we'll ask you to click on, and we'll ask you to complete the feedback survey that way. We really appreciate you taking a few moments to fill this out. It's not very long. It does allow us to understand your experience in today's webinar and really to enhance our future TTAC offerings and provide our wonderful presenter, Kadija, as well with some feedback too. So with that, I want to thank you all for joining us, and I'm going to hand it over to my wonderful partner and colleague in this work, Evelyn Blank, who is the Associate Executive Director at the New York Center for Child Development, who will walk us through a brief introduction before our presenter begins. So Evelyn, would you like to take it away? I think we might just need Kevin to unmute it. Go right ahead. Sorry, Evelyn. Go for it.
I just want to welcome everybody today, and thank you, Meg. We're really thrilled to be offering a fourth webinar with Kadija Johnston, who I'll introduce in a moment, and we feel like this is just such a timely and important topic today. But first, a little word about who TTAC is. TTAC is the New York City Early Childhood Mental Health Training and Technical Assistance Center, otherwise known as TTAC, and it's funded through Thrive New York City, which is in partnership with the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. TTAC is a partnership between the New York Center for Child Development and the McSilver Institute on Poverty, Policy, and Research. New York Center for Child Development has been a major provider of early childhood mental health services in New York, and we have expertise in informing policy and supporting the field of early childhood mental health, and we do this through both training and direct practice. NYU McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research houses the Community and Managed Care Technical Assistance Centers, which offer clinic, business, and system transformation support statewide to all behavioral health providers. TTAC is tasked with building the capacity and competencies of mental health and early childhood professionals through ongoing training and technical assistance. And I would encourage everybody to go to our website, ttacny.org, and where you'll be able to access previous webinars, including 3 previous webinars by Kadija Johnston, with upcoming events as well as other resources. So it is now my privilege to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Kadija Johnston, who's a clinical social worker who's been a practitioner in the field of infant and early childhood mental health since 1985. And I just want to say that she's been a true pioneer in the field of early childhood mental health consultation. She is the past director of the Infant Parent Program at the University of California, San Francisco, where she pioneered the program's approach to early childhood mental health consultation. And to note that this approach that serves as a model for other organizations, both locally, nationally, as well as internationally. And she's disseminated the model in 23 states as well as internationally. Currently, Ms. Johnston is on the faculty at Georgetown University Center for Child and Human Development, where she is contributing her expertise and experience in mental health consultation to the SAMHSA-supported Center of Excellence in Early Childhood Mental Health Consultation. She's active in many local and national organizations involving infancy and early childhood. She writes and lectures nationally on infant and early childhood mental health. And in addition to numerous articles, she co-authored the book, Mental Health Consultation in Childcare, Transforming Relationships with Directors, Staff, and Families. This is really a seminal work that really is kind of used and kind of referred to constantly. In the next phase of her journey, Kadija is committed in devoting energy to instilling equity, diversity, and inclusion principles with greater intentionality and more explicitly in her personal and professional practice. So thank you, Kadija. It is a real pleasure to have you back today, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Evelyn, and Meg, and Kevin and Nicole for all your support, both in preparation and in today's webinar. So welcome, everyone. Today I'm going to be speaking with you about early childhood mental health consultation's role in addressing inequities, how we can, and I believe how we have an obligation to be disruptors of systemic oppression, to really be powerful voices for equity. Speaking out about, focusing on the social justice facet of our work at this moment in our nation's journey is very poignant and meaningful for me. I come to you as we are, of course, struggling with a huge health crisis that has served to highlight long-standing systemic inequities. And the pandemic's unveiling of structural injustice in employment, in healthcare, and education has been amplified by bringing much needed attention to the often fatal impact of anti-Black racism in policing. In only this past week, we've learned of even more atrocities in the form of forced sterilizations and continued child-parent separations of detained Latinx immigrants. These recent events represent and have been preceded by so much systemic and structurally induced carnage, pain, and loss. In this sober and sobering context, I feel beholden and privileged to be able to use this platform as a place from which to project a message that acknowledges what has gone wrong for so long, and to offer some sense, a little ray of light for how we, as early childhood mental health consultation professionals, can and are working to right some of these injustices. So, in honor of 2 giants of social justice, may we fight for the things we care about, and do it in a way that will lead others to join us in making good trouble, necessary trouble. I want to begin, or perhaps more accurately to begin again, by orienting you a little bit to the terrain that we'll travel in the next hour and a half. As I said, we'll talk about early childhood mental health consultations' role in addressing inequities, but the portion of the topography that we'll focus on is somewhat limited. Today, we're going to look at early childhood mental health consultations' efforts and impacts on inequities in one system, early care and education. The choice of this focus is because early childhood consultation is practiced most extensively there, and it has the longest history with this early childhood setting. And consequently, the emerging evidence of its efficacy on equity issues comes from early care and education. Obviously, systemic inequities exert sway in every institution in this country, from preschool to policing, child welfare to child find efforts to homeland insecurity and health care. Early childhood mental health consultation efforts are extending to several of these systems. In fact, the program that I previously directed provides mental health consultation to prenatal and pediatric health care providers, child welfare, residential substance abuse treatment, and domestic violence and homeless shelter staff. So it is applicable across all settings. But while I will speak about ECE, these principles and practices I describe are applicable beyond ECE. Another kind of aspect of the narrowness of today's talk is that I will concentrate almost exclusively on one form of oppression and injury. I'm going to speak almost exclusively about structural racism, its deleterious impact and possibilities for undoing in ECE. Obviously, anti-Black racism isn't the sole inequity in our country. Even in early education, we could, and I think should, spotlight other issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, such as access to high-quality bilingual programs for dual language learners, and address the segregated learning experience for disabled children. Advocacy for changes in these and many other areas of early childhood is much needed. And as early childhood mental health professionals, our expertise in all of these areas is valuably contributed. So I hope you can take some of what I talk about today and extend it in the fight for social justice to other arenas. Okay, so that too was mostly a disclaimer and a bit of orientation, but now for a third beginning, I'm going to give you an overview of the webinar. I'm first going to describe research findings that demonstrate the racial disparities in early education. As we become familiar with these institutional inequities, we'll then turn our attention to another set of studies showing the beneficial impact of early childhood mental health consultation on reducing racial disproportionalities in disciplinary and expulsion practices in child care and changing teacher perception. Based on recent research and by revisiting elements of the consultative stance, which was the focus of an earlier webinar in this series, we will identify aspects of early childhood mental health consultations that catalyze change. Throughout the talk, I hope that you'll ponder the power of the intervention you are engaged in as a disruptor of racism and white supremacy, and be thinking about your role as proponents of social justice. So now we really are starting. In broad developmental terms, I think we all appreciate that experiences in childcare matter. It also matters in mental health terms and in terms of racial identity formation and the pernicious perpetuation of structural racism. I want to be clear that I'm not singling out, though, or lambasting ECE programs. The institution of childcare and the individuals who work in the industry are valuable and vital, especially now in the pandemic. Despite the pressure and peril of the position, early educators are giving of themselves, as they always do, greatly. And in the field in general, the early childhood field has made great strides to offer all children high quality care. Equity in access is actually an explicit goal of ECE. Early childhood education is grounded in the ideal that all children deserve access to equal, high-quality early learning opportunities to prepare them to succeed in school. While there has been marked progress in this effort in the recent decades, there are still some grave disparities, though, based on race, socioeconomic status, and gender with regards to children's access to and experience in early education settings. Attending high-quality early education has been shown to be related to a vast array of positive benefits, especially for children from low-income families. Yet, children of color who are low-income are less likely to gain access to high-quality early childhood education programs and are more likely to attend poorly resourced programs. For instance, African American children are least likely to be enrolled in ECE programs that are considered high quality and are rated lower on their school readiness at age 4. In addition, low resource programs are more likely to be in low-income communities where the staff of those centers themselves face many of the same stressors as the families who use the service, including food and housing insecurity, unsafe communities, and lack of health resources. Evidence shows that unmet health and mental health needs of early childhood education staff, such as depression and severe job stress, negatively affect ways in which these educators interact with and can be available to children. One of the most glaring examples of disparities in early care and education settings is in expulsionary discipline. Research to date has demonstrated that children of color experience harsher discipline for the same behavior as their white peers. Starting as young as infancy, children of color are at highest risk for being expelled from early care and education. In a study that many of you are probably aware of that happened over a decade ago, my colleague from Yale, Walter Gilliam, found that while African American children make up only 19% of preschool enrollment, they comprise almost 50% of preschoolers suspended. In a subsequent study, he found that higher rates of expulsion were associated with higher reports of teacher stress and depression, large classroom size, and less access to mental health consultation. While the short-term effects of exclusionary practices such as expulsion and suspension don't even have the intended outcome, they don't correlate to children's behavior being less disruptive or unmanageable. But the longer-term impacts are doubly detrimental. When children are suspended or expelled, they lose access to needed referrals to other services and supports, especially for children with developmental delays or whose difficulties are due to trauma. The so-called remedy usually actually compounds the problem, to say nothing of repeatedly receiving the message that the child does that he is unwanted, unstoppable, undeserving of care, and dangerous. These messages accrue and are internalized in a child's sense of themselves. Success in school and other aspects of life depends on a sense of agency, and at the very least, a benign, if not mostly positive sense of who you are and what the world has to offer. Being excluded from childcare serially by the time you're 3 does not support that sense of self. We can and should be saddened but not surprised then that children excluded from preschool don't typically do well academically later in life. And these early strikes against a child, coupled with having to interact with other oppressive systems, result in them being more likely to be incarcerated. Some data place the elevated risk for these outcomes at 10 times the likelihood for children who have not experienced expulsion. I think my colleague Walter Gilliam and Chantel Meek summed it up really well when they said what the data is showing us is that young children of color have less front door access to high quality care, and they are pushed out the back door at disproportionate rates. So how do we explain what accounts for disparate disciplinary practices? I want to say it's really important to acknowledge that the reasons for suspension and expulsion are complex and in most cases probably multi-determined. Scholars and researchers, though, have identified 4 contributors: low program quality, as you see here, inadequate knowledge of child development, early childhood trauma, and racial bias. Each of those explanations deserves attention and analysis, and as early childhood mental health consultants, we should be equipped and we regularly engage in addressing all of those variables. Today, I'm going to focus exclusively on racial bias. So why, you might ask, did I choose this focus? In addition to being a personal commitment to contribute to addressing structural racism, there is increasing evidence that racism is the major contributor to these disciplinary disparities. So let's review some of the studies that lead to the conclusion that racial bias is what undergirds most of the harmful disciplinary practices in early care and education. And here again, I'm going to reference Walter Gilliam's work, as I will throughout today's talk. In a relatively recent study, 135 preschool teachers were asked to watch a videotape of children in a child care setting. And they were asked to watch for challenging behavior, when actually there were no egregious or even minor acts of unruly or aggressive behavior. In fact, the 4 children in the film were child actors. One was a white girl, one was an African-American girl, one was an African-American boy, and one was a white boy. All of the teachers spent the most time looking at the black boy. African-American teachers watched the black boys the most, and second most the black girls. The studies tell us a lot. They give us an explanation about the role that this plays in determining perception, that race plays in determining perception. Where we go looking for trouble, we're prone to find it. We're likely to identify difficulty where we literally set our sights. In a second study that Walter did, teachers were asked to read a description of a child's behavior and rate the severity. Now, the details of the story were always the same, but the child was described, some of the difficulties were that the child was described as having a hard time napping and following instructions and running out of the classroom, not taking turns. But the only difference in the description given to teachers to read was the name ascribed to the child. What was picked were the most popular in that year of the study, African-American and white names. So the fictitious children were referred to as either Deshaun or Jake if they were boys, and LaToya or Emily if they were girls. In addition to the description of the child's behavior, some teachers were given information about the child's family situation, and that narrative described the context for the child's behavior, indicating that the child's home life was turbulent and violent. The father was described as mostly absent, and the mother was said to be struggling to make ends meet, working multiple jobs. So what were the outcomes? Regardless of the race of the teacher reading the story, if the teacher assumed because of the name that the child was white, the behavior was rated as more severe. What does that finding suggest? It suggests that teachers expect African-American children to behave badly. It's not seen as extraordinary or unusual. Additionally, and equally dismaying, all teachers said they felt more hopeless when in addition to hearing a description of the child's behavior, they got the family background. I don't know. Are you surprised by those findings? Because I was. I've been pondering it still and was pondering it for a long time. So one possible explanation is that information about the child's family does not in and of itself encourage empathy on the part of the teacher. As mental health consultants, we seek to enhance providers' curiosity about and understanding of the meaning of children's behavior, especially behavior they see as worrisome or problematic. And we know that children's life circumstances influence how they feel and act. Encouraging appreciation of this connection between home life and past experiences and behavior in childcare and building empathic capacity are cornerstones of our consultation practice. So this study was quite dismaying when we were told that knowing about a child's background and current circumstances doesn't increase hopefulness or empathy. This tells us that offering information is not enough to inspire empathy. So we have to ask ourselves, what does encourage empathy? Another finding of this study may offer at least a partial answer. When the teacher's race and the perceived race of the child's match, then both the white and the black teachers rated the severity of the behavior as lower. They said they would respond with less harsh discipline, all signs of empathy. They said they had more hope that they could help this child, and they felt more confident about their ability to care for them. This empathy effect is consistent with other literature. It suggests that people are more inclined to help those who they perceive as like them. The question then for us as mental health consultants are, how can this phenomena, the empathy effect, how can it inform our work? How do we encourage understanding and empathy and promote an appreciation of diversity and difference? How do we become ambassadors of equity and cultural responsivity and intervene in racially biased practices? So we're going to spend the rest of our time together today, and hopefully long after this webinar ends, pondering and attempting to answer those very questions. I, of course, am going to offer some ideas and tell you what we are learning from recent studies in early childhood mental health consultation. So obviously, awareness of the problem, as you just heard about, is a necessary initial first step. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. We have to take action. Efforts to address racial inequities can and need to take many forms, from the individual to the programmatic to policy. And I think one of the benefits of early childhood mental health consultation is that it intervenes at all of those levels. The advantages are not only our ecological breadth, of additional advantage is our point of entry, the first years of a child's life. At the level of individual children, our early entry affords us the opportunity to address inequities before they are internalized aspects of a child's identity, or at least when they're just beginning to form. We know that early experiences in relationships shape, in large measure, define a child's sense of self and the way they view the world. The messages young children receive from the important adults in their lives, including those providing early education, get internalized. For good or for ill, these calcifying views of self and other are the building blocks, not only of identity formation, but of an individual's mental health. The beliefs, feelings, and expectations you hold about who you are and what the world has to offer, how safe or cruel, responsive or annihilating, impact one's mental and physical health. The racialized lenses that allow us to see a 3-year-old as scary, threatening, or unworthy of our love diminishes and tarnishes that child's sense of themselves. These misattributions also inform their view of the world. Conversely, perpetuating whiteness as the norm and allowing white privilege to go unchallenged encourages the dangerous myth of white supremacy to be inculcated in white children. The debilitating impacts of racism are felt by all children, and all children's identity is affected, making structural racism and other forms of oppression a mental health issue, and therefore necessarily attended to by those of us in the mental health field. Although child-focused consultation is valuable, I also want to stress that the purview of our practice extends far beyond the ability to address bias aimed at individual children. Through classroom and programmatic consultation with teachers and directors, we have the opportunity to have a broader impact on all the children in the setting, even those we may never see or meet because they come later in a teacher's tenure. Will hopefully benefit if a provider's or a program's stance toward inclusion and equity have been beneficially shaped by our presence. Regardless of whether we are addressing bias around a particular child or throughout a center, we adhere to the notion that the effective interventions are aimed at adults who directly care for or more distally implement programs on or make policies that affect young children. If we need confirmation, studies are confirming the potential power and benefit of our practice. So let's start by looking at the benefit of mental health consultation on expulsion. And many of you are probably aware of this, also Walter Gilliam's 2005 study that revealed that children were least likely to be excluded from care when mental health practitioners were predictably present. Early childhood mental health consultation has really risen to national prominence in large measure because of its impact on reducing preschool expulsion and the associated inequitable distribution of that practice with regard to race. But expulsion is a pretty extreme bellwether of bias. We would imagine, and we know, that prior to being barred from a child care program, many children, even those who are not expelled, have experienced microaggressions, distortions fueled by racism or other forms of bias around gender, or immigration status, or disability, and that those are experienced daily. So I want to look at some research with you related to the less extreme but no less dangerous disciplinary practices and how mental health consultation impacts those. Data collected from statewide early childhood mental health consultation system in Arizona, called SMART Support, is showing that early childhood mental health consultation is impacting teachers' perception and treatment of children of color. So when a child was the focus of mental health consultation, a child-centered consultation, using pre- and post-DECAs, data was collected on those children prior to and after consultation. Initially, children of color were cast as the most deficient or problematic in their behavior related to other children who were also of concern. And specifically, African American and Latino boys were perceived least positively. However, after consultation, the reverse was true. African American and Latino boys were perceived more positively by their teachers. They initially had the lowest scores on initiative, self-control, closeness, and highest scores on conflict, expulsion risk. And yet, the growth in the perception of the teacher in a positive direction continued over a 5-month period. And again, after a year, after consultation had concluded, the perception of those children was still held to be positive. While these findings are encouraging and should be celebrated, what these studies don't tell us is why were we effective as mental health consultants? How were we effective? What did mental health consultants do to achieve these outcomes? So now I'm going to suggest and describe some work, 3 levels of work that we can and I think need to involve ourselves in order to dismantle systemic oppression. I'm going to list them briefly here and then talk more extensively about them. First and foundationally, I think we commit to a practice of self-examination and a course of study related to how we have been racialized. We begin by examining our own biases. As we cultivate our own capacity to tolerate discomfort and cede power, attempt vulnerability, and acknowledge privilege when present, the more we can extend ourselves to others, the interpersonal level. And then we should, I believe, at the structural level, we have opportunities within and expanding beyond our role as mental health consultants to advocate and work for social justice. Within our role, we can identify and challenge discriminatory processes and practices in the programs with whom we consult. Our advocacy efforts, informed by our mental health expertise, though, can be directed at broader systems change through being involved in work on changing legislation or recruiting and sustaining a more diverse early childhood mental health consultation workforce, or including equity training and on-the-job support for mental health consultants. These are just a few examples aimed at systemic change. But let's explore each of these levels or areas in more depth. Let's start with self-awareness, because it is at the center of all of our work as mental health professionals and hopefully as human beings. And it's the foundation from which we can provide attuned, high-quality services for young children and those who care for them. I've provided here a quote from the diversity-informed tenets for work with infants, children, and families. Now, the diversity-informed tenets are a set of strategies for strengthening our commitment and capacity to embed diversity, inclusion, and equity practices in our work. And the first principle of the tenet is self-awareness. It states that working with infants, children, and families requires all individuals, organizations, and systems of care to reflect on our own cultures, values, and beliefs, and on the impact that racism, classism, sexism, ableism, homophobia, xenophobia, and other systems of oppression have had on our lives in order to be able to provide diversity-informed, culturally attuned practices. Critical self-reflection is what we need, from my perspective, to engage in. This requires reevaluating our assumptions, attributions, and the held meaning of our kind of racialized orientation. Critical self-reflection is a lifelong process, essential to our ability to be effective stewards of equity. Through critical self-reflection, we foster self-awareness around equity and diversity by regularly and rigorously examining our assumptions, attitudes, beliefs, and biases. We strive to acknowledge the identities and instances where we hold power and privilege, as well as those parts of who we are or occasions in which we have been oppressed or have oppressed others. Other key components of self-awareness in the context of culture and race include aptitudes like growing our ability to address racial and cultural biases and deficit-based perspectives. We strive to become alert to discomforts and emotional responses when race and diversity issues arise, and then mindfully learn to lean in, to hold space for our consultees' discomfort and emotional responses. It's equally important, I think, for us to cultivate the vulnerability and transparency, to recognize the limits of or the inaccuracies in our understanding of historical antecedents of structural oppression, or to recognize when we lack knowledge and appreciation for cultural norms and values of people whose identities differ from our own, and then to seek genuine and greater understanding. Obviously, our self-awareness impacts how we show up as mental health consultants, how we bring ourselves to, and the kind of relationships we establish with our consultees, the interpersonal part, is being shown to really matter. There is theoretical and now growing empirical evidence that the power of consultation, early childhood mental health consultations practice, resides primarily in, it relies heavily on interpersonal attributes. The mental health consultant-educator relationship is a mutative agent, a change agent. Our ability to make relationships is our superpower. Recent research cites the importance of the relationship between the consultant and the consultee as the central contributor to positive change in child care center climate and child outcomes. Focusing on the characteristics of mental health consultation that correlate to effectiveness, Green and her colleagues found that the quality of the mental health consultant child staff and child care staff relationship was the single most salient predictor of perceived efficacy in mental health consultation. And then subsequent studies have confirmed that link between the strength of the consultant-provider relationship and a range of positive program child caregiver and child outcomes. The relationship reflects the extent to which the teacher and the mental health consultant perceive that they are partners in the work. It's described, a good relationship, it's described by the providers as one that includes warmth and positive emotional tone from the consultant, where the relationship is characterized as equitable, where the consultant doesn't assert their expertise or power. Stronger consultant-consultee relationships are facilitated, though, by the consistency of the consultant's availability. How regularly are we working with the child care program? It's also enhanced by the ability to take the perspective of others, to communicate clearly, to demonstrate respect for the unique culture of each child care center, and the willingness to explore potentially difficult topics. Those characteristics of the relationship I just mentioned are identified by providers in their own words about what they feel describes a positive relationship with the consultant. The relationship, the consultant-consultee relationship, actually has a special role in reducing implicit bias. To gain understanding of how and for whom mental health consultation was working and whether it was working for children of color, a recent study cited here by Annie Davis, Eva Schreiber, and Deborah Perry looked at whether variables related to race and culture affected the consultative relationship. They found that the quality of the consultative relationship, or what they refer to as the consultative alliance, had a significant impact on outcomes when the focus of the consultation was a child of color. When the focused child was a child of color, the strength of the consultative alliance most greatly impacted the provider's attention to the child, their attachment to the child, and the provider's confidence in her ability to support the child's need was greatest for children of color. The power of the consultant-consultee relationship depended on the consultant's level of confidence, though. Confidence in their capacities related to culture, equity, and diversity. In other words, consultants who saw themselves as well-versed, who described themselves as well-versed in practicing self-reflection exercises, in being culturally responsive practices as a part of what they learned about, and skilled in addressing issues of equity. Those consultants were the ones who were able to make more of a difference. And if the ethnic or racial match between the provider and the consultant was there, that mattered mightily. Taken together, these results suggest that adopting an explicit equity lens along with shared racial identity exponentially enhances the effectiveness of infant and early childhood mental health consultation in addressing racial injustices and promoting equity. The emerging evidence that the Alliance is a key factor in our ability to be disruptors of racialized disparities has prompted deeper inquiry, at least for me, into the question, what is it in early childhood mental health consultants' way of being that promotes not only building the Alliance, but the ability through that relationship to address and impact teachers' perspectives about children of color? We have to recognize that this research that I'm just citing was most of the time consultants did not say that they were explicitly working on being dismantlers of racial inequity. They didn't actively or explicitly engage in these conversations. So what if we did? I'm going to suggest that aspects of early childhood mental health consultants' comportment, again, this relationship, are surfacing as instrumental and therefore have to be looked at. My co-author, Charles Brinneman, and I coined a term for this effective way of being. We refer to this as being the consultative stance. If you participated in previous webinars in this series, you're familiar not only with the term, but probably with the 10 elements that I listed. And I will show you again here. Today, I'm going to focus on the stance as a tool to disrupt systemic oppression and promote equity. And I'm not going to touch on every element, but just a few that I feel have greatest significance in addressing bias and enhancing our cultural sensitivity and encouraging equity in childcare. Beginning with parallel process, premised on parallel process, the consultative stance really creates space for critical self-reflection, uncomfortable conversations, and tolerance for the vulnerability essential to examining bias, often resulting in perceptual shifts or expansions. The provider's attitude and approach toward children in their care can be amended, in turn promoting positive responses in the child and a more equitable and inclusive classroom atmosphere. While we have come to see the way in which the consultant treats the consultee, the parallel process, to be a primary feature of being able to address bias, additional considerations, skills, and strategies are of course needed. And we begin, or I'll begin, with an inventory of the factors influencing the consultee's perspective and behavior. That's where we have to start, is learning what's influencing the consultee's behavior. And there are many influences on how child care providers view children and do their job. The consultant seeks to identify the forces, both current and historical, internal, interpersonal, and systemic, that influence the provider's perceptions of a child, coworkers, classroom situation, or for that matter, how do these factors influence how they view us as mental health consultants? Child care providers, like all of us, are susceptible to the constant drone of distortions aimed at preserving white privilege and bias against all who are not white. Alert to the pervasiveness of racialized meaning-making and prejudice, the consultant attunes to attributions and distortions that belie these biases. She also recognizes that culture, her own and each provider's and child's, colors how ideas and feelings are expressed, and reciprocally, how they are understood. The value placed on dependency or autonomy, or the meaning given to making eye contact or averting gaze is culturally determined. A provider's cultural constructs like those, in concert with internalized notions of race, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, language ability, and other identity factors, impacts how she perceives and treats children, families, and coworkers. So I'm suggesting that a lot of our attention as mental health consultants go toward understanding these internalized lenses in providers, attending to their subjective experience. A mental health approach assumes and therefore addresses the ways that providers are influenced by and respond to children based on these multiple factors in themselves. A diversity-informed approach includes and elevates attending to cultures, systems of oppression, power, and privilege. These factors are examined for how they support or interfere with child care providers' ability to see and respond to their child charges. For example, having had to leave her own children behind in her home country, a provider is intolerant of an infant's displays of dependency. It's too painful to respond to another child's needs when you can't respond to your own child's needs. Or immersed in a society that tells us African American men are threats, an Asian American teacher labels an energetic 3-year-old's displays of dexterity as menacing. When asked what she imagines it's like to be the sole African American family in a program, a white center director states confidently, oh, we're colorblind here. Everybody's treated the same, whether they're black, white, or green. Undoubtedly, the lenses that lead to these interpretations, these misinterpretations, also predispose the provider to misinterpret and respond poorly to these children's and families' needs. The mental health consultant has to help to remove internal impediments to accurately interpreting children's behavior. It's a prerequisite to providing attuned responsive care. So therefore, we work a lot at understanding and, when need be, helping to revise a provider's interpretations based on her subjective experience. How do we do this? Through another aspect of the consultative stance referred to as wondering instead of knowing. Wondering, being curious with caregivers with whom we are consulting, can encourage, whether for a moment or more deeply, reflection. Reflection in the service of unearthing the bias or the basis for beliefs and biases that lead to distortions like the ones I just described. Asking elicits the provider's currently held ideas about why a child is behaving as they are. And at the same time, being curious, inquiring. At the same time, that suggests that multiple or alternate views can be entertained and exist. Wishing to understand how meaning is ascribed and broaden the possibilities for why a child or family is behaving as they are, the consultant could inquire of the teacher in the scenario with the energetic 3-year-old something like, what about his behavior frightens you? Or ask of the director afflicted with color blindness, one could ask, I'm really curious, how did that notion of not identifying race as a feature of a family's experience get adopted in the program? Questions, if they are genuinely posited from a place of interest, can identify and sometimes begin to shift a provider's views. Cultivating reflective capacity can be a disruptor of bias. Now, I want to say that while it is never easy to see a family or child treated or talked about badly, like the examples I just gave, maintaining one's emotional equilibrium, remaining curious and non-judgmental, is especially difficult when the provider's perceptions appear to be based on racism or other biases. If you can stay regulated enough to be curious, there may be instances, though, where a question actually feels too opaque a response. It may feel like a declarative statement denouncing a blatantly biased belief or action is called for. So how do we address those instances? And I have recently become familiar with and found the idea of calling in or calling out to be helpful in making the distinction between and having language to more gracefully execute in either direction. So let me describe what each of these are. Calling in is an invitation for the person who has misperceived, offended, or caused harm to reflect on and expand their view or amend their bias. It involves asking questions, and the exchange, I think, benefits from being done in private or individually. The inquisitive strategy can create openness. The purpose is to create openness, to reflect, to explore meaning and understanding across difference. It is akin to the concept of wondering and not knowing, and so calling in is typically the intervention of choice in early childhood mental health consultation. On the other hand, calling out is intended to interrupt, at least momentarily, harm, to stop harm from happening in the moment, or to publicly expose an oppressive behavior or belief. Therefore, calling out is usually done in a group, and it takes the form of a statement, not a question. While it's unlikely to change a person's underlying belief, it can change behavior and require more accountability on the part of the person who's done the harm, therefore preventing further harm. I'm going to provide you a list, such a smallly fonted list that you probably can't read it, but you will have access to these slides for future reference. So I've provided a couple or several examples of calling in questions and calling out statements. As you can see, the examples I gave earlier about how I would question the teacher or the director fall into the calling in category. My intention in those hypothetical situations, and generally in mental health consultation, is to promote reflective capacity and internal shifts that lead to changes in perception and behavior that will remain because they're internalized. They'll remain when I'm out of sight and after the consultation relationship has ended. Calling out, though, might be employed in mental health consultation to protect, particularly to protect a child from harm. Hearing, let's say, a provider say that only sissy boys play dress up as she roughly removes the tutu from a child, or hearing an African-American child be told that the police are going to be called if they don't start behaving better, might be instances where, at least for me, I would think of employing calling out. Perhaps saying something like, you know I don't usually step in, but I feel really concerned about the impact on this child of what you are suggesting. I think those words and ideas could be pretty scary. The statement is intended as much for the child as for the adult, but it is always followed by a desire, an invitation to talk further to the adult so that, one, you can explain what worried you and hear more about the teacher's intentions. We know that most biases are based in seeing differences as frightening or bad or in some way problematic. When we stop othering and get to know people who are different than us, that's when biases usually dissipate. Proximity promotes the possibility to identify how we are similar to one another, and in turn enhances empathy. Remember earlier on in this morning's talk when I cited a study, Walter Gilliam's study, in which information was insufficient, but that when providers thought they shared the same race, they were like the family who was struggling, then they were able to empathize not only with the parent's plight, but also with the child. That's what we're trying to think about, is how, given that matching of attributes like race, class, or sexual orientation is often not the case, what we're trying to answer the question of is how do we become, how does mental health consultation foster a sense of sameness across perceived difference to encourage empathy? I believe that identifying and amplifying similarities and employing analogies are potentially potent strategies. Hearing a teacher who immigrated several years earlier from El Salvador express her frustration with families who recently arrived from Somalia and are not following the center's rules, a mental health consultant could try to draw a connection, saying something like, you know, I remember you told me how confusing and difficult it was to figure out unfamiliar systems when you came to this country. I wonder if these families from Africa are baffled by the program's procedure, and that accounts for the missteps that so bother you. So far I've spoken about aspects of the consultant-consultee relationship, but of course we all know that providers mostly don't do their work alone. They work with others. So I'm going to spend just a few minutes at the end of our time now talking about how we can work with groups of providers to share and, when need be, change perspectives within a group. As we acknowledged earlier, despite the fact that difference is inevitable and ubiquitous, differences, especially racial differences, tend to be at best discounted and often the cause of conflict, not just in ECE. So when working with a group of providers or a provider and a parent, we should, one, expect different perspectives and find opportunities to communicate the richness that comes from multiple perspectives. When hearing from a parent of a child who never naps at the center that sleep is a regular part of the home routine, the consultant can convey curiosity about the meaning of the difference and express the sense that there's something to be gained from figuring out what contributes to the difference, not from trying to figure out who's right or wrong, better or worse. Attempting to align around white supremacy, racism, and sexual orientation or other socially charged differences is, of course, more difficult, but equally, if not more important. Therefore, it seems essential to establish agreements in our consultative work, agreements about bringing these topics into consultative conversations, and agreements about what the guideposts, mutually creating ground rules for discussion around equity, race, and white supremacy. Establishing these agreements up front is advisable. When entering a consultative relationship, typically an agreement is negotiated. The contract, or maybe it's a less formal agreement, but the contract involves a process of establishing joint expectations. What we do in the beginning of a relationship between ourselves or our agencies as mental health consultants and those of ECE is that we talk about what we're going to contribute and what we expect the ECE program and providers to contribute. We might describe at this point what we commit to. I'm suggesting that in the same spirit as the way we inform our consultees about our theoretical orientation, or when we're going to be at the site, the parameters of our roles, or our obligations, such as child abuse reporting. At that same time, we can assert our intention and commitment to pay attention to how program practices and policies differentially impact or are potentially harmful to children and families based on racial or other biases such as gender, ableism, and sexual orientation. We create agreements where everybody agrees that we're going to attend to and talk about these. In the context of established agreements, the consultant then seeks to hear and represent all voices, always with permission and usually usefully distilled. Whenever necessary, the consultant represents the perspective about race or bias from one consultee to another, with the eventual aim, though, of increasing the adult in that child care community's capacity to and belief that they can, a belief in the usefulness of communicating directly to one another. The consultant then is demonstrating that various views on race can be held and heard equally and actually add to the understanding of a situation with a child or other circumstances. Lastly, patience. Just as we are encouraged and we attempt to foster patience in the caregivers, their relationships with children and families, we must also be patient with child care providers and the pace of change or dismantling of systems of oppression. Patience may be especially difficult to conjure right now when injustices are increasingly apparent, inequities are increasing, and futures feel uncertain. It's important that the patience I am talking about cultivating be recognized as not passive. We must attempt to balance skilled action and advocacy with alert persistence, compassionate endurance, and forceful fortitude for ourselves as well as for those with whom we consult. So we try also to hold hope. We know that child care providers often, and especially now, are losing hope in the face of daily crises and accruing losses. The consultant must maintain her belief in change in a slowly shifting system and a moment of crisis. The consultant can also hold hope in the child care providers and parents because we are the only ones who regularly have the luxury of stepping back and looking at a seemingly static system to see possibilities. Here again, I recognize that sustaining this stance of hope may be challenging, and the forms it takes may need to be adapted to the moment. But there is no time that I can think of when the concept of holding hope is more important than right now. So we remind ourselves, in the words of James Baldwin, that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed till it is faced. And to end where we began, to quote Representative John Lewis, don't get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful. Be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It's the struggle of a lifetime. Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble. Here's to necessary trouble. And thank you.
This is Evelyn Blake again. Kadija, thank you for such an informative and powerful webinar. This is just so important at this point, and we really appreciate it. Before we go to questions, I just wanted to remind everybody, please do go to the chat box if you have questions, and also please fill out the evaluation. We lean very heavily on feedback from you in shaping our webinars and further trainings, and would really appreciate your feedback. So the first question here is, please discuss how historical trauma is connected to in this webinar and how it plays in between staff and students.
So I hope that it was evident in references to explanations of racism that historical trauma affects all of us. Obviously, most deeply, African American people and Indigenous American, Native American people, and others of color who have experienced historically genocide and these deep harms. And also that historical racism affects those of us who are white identified in the pernicious way in which the impacts continue to allow those of us who are white to not acknowledge the ways in which power and privilege have been afforded and continue to exert themselves in every aspect of our interactions. So that I feel like that hopefully what was explained was that starting with our own self-awareness related to our identities and where we fall in any moment because of intersectionality and changing identities or social locations, that where we fall in relation to power or privilege is going to impact how we bring forward ourselves and how we are able to attune to historical trauma. I think that also one of the things that I didn't speak explicitly about is I think it's another way in which we as mental health consultants, if we are studied and versed in the history of this country in relationship to systemic and structural oppression, that what we recognize is then what we're well situated to talk about is what trauma does, the impacts of trauma. So that if we can overlay our understanding of the impacts of trauma and relate that to historical trauma, we know that trauma fragments. Trauma has the capacity to numb, that trauma actually causes individuals within themselves and interpersonally to splinter. So we use our understanding, our clinical understanding of trauma, not to pathologize, but to promote the possibility of understanding the impact when we see it of historical trauma exerting itself in current circumstances. And we treat it in the same way that we would treat contemporary trauma, meaning that we start with asking ourselves the question of not what's wrong with this person because of how they're behaving, but rather that we ask ourselves, oh, what happened? What happened in this person's history that this is how they perceive a situation? And we recognize that none of us are immune from the impact.
Thank you. So another question.
We've obviously talked for a millennium about that all-encompassing question. So I recognize that my response is also a titrated one.
Absolutely. Thank you. Do you have any thoughts about concrete practices for mental health consultants who cannot practice in person but are only using visual distanced interventions?
I know that this is obviously at the forefront of all of our minds right now, and we are all learning together and hopefully sharing our experiences, successes, and failures of doing this work remotely with one another. At the same time that I would say that I hope that what I have suggested as interventions related to racial inequities, that those transcend technology. Recognizing that it is absolutely easier to have the kinds of interpersonal exchanges that I suggested if you already had a relationship with a provider in person, rather than if you are starting a relationship long distance. But I would suggest, as I talked about at the end, close to the end, this idea of agreements and finding ways in our agreements, both our formal and informal agreements about what the collaboration in consultation is going to look like, that we begin to try to include describing conversations around race and racial equity, and how we might be including those conversations in our exchange, whether those are remote or whether they're in person. I think specifically around the ideas of a remote interaction, that one of the things that we do need to be generally more aware of is the creating of not just agreements, but of other parameters of the conversation. That what we are all finding is the ways in which time is fluid, the ways in which we need to establish ritual, or as I am referring to them, transitional markers, because they are not as easily accessible to us as they were when we were in person. So that I believe that it's important to begin to, again, co-create with our consultees and the parents we may be consulting with, that we talk about the parameters in every encounter. You know, how much time are we going to leave at the end of a Zoom call to be able to talk about what the impact of the time together has meant? What will the provider be doing after she gets off the call? And is there a possibility for her to be able to take 5 minutes to reflect on the conversation? One of the things that we think about as a primary outcome of mental health consultation is to support and enhance reflective capacity. So thinking about how through technology reflection can be cultivated seems essential at this time. And again, that is a huge arena, that question, and appreciate having a chance to respond to it in an obviously limited and perhaps then unsatisfying way.
Terrific. So there was another question, whether or not you have any recommendations for raising this issue within a system that does not prioritize or understand its importance. Like it's not an issue here, or we have other issues that need to be addressed.
So what sounds promising is that if somebody has already figured out, meaning if the mental health consultant asking this question or the person asking this question has already figured out that the center or program feels that this is not an issue, I would say that bodes well, because it means you've already raised it in some form or fashion. And part of how I think about it is the idea that we think about that response of it's not an issue here, or we don't see color, that we think about it as potentially, and I am not saying that this is always the case, but potentially as a psychological defense, that we don't take it at face value, and that we think about as mental health professionals, how do you address a defense? And that one of the things I'm suggesting, or I hope was clear in my suggestion, is that we begin to challenge a defense gently but persistently by inquiring. How is it that a site has come to feel as if it's not an issue? What are the factors that make it not an issue? What that does, in addition to hopefully asking the consultees to reflect on their statement that racism and other forms of inequity are not an issue in their program, in addition to reflecting on why they believe that and perhaps opening up some possibility for broadening of beliefs, what it also does is that it gives us an opportunity to, if what a program tells us is it's not an issue because we're an all-white program, or we don't have any indicators that anybody is feeling upset or harmed, is this then it gives us some opportunity to ask, and I would always ask permission, but I would ask about whether it would be okay if we introduced the idea of definitions around structural racism. What I mean by that is the way in which of beginning an educative function of consultation. A lot of times the reason, if it's not a psychological defense, that people believe that that issues of racism don't impact them and therefore should not be discussed is because of a lack of awareness and understanding of the history in our country of systemic racism that then pervades all institutions. So this might be an opportunity to ask if we can insert some information and education around systemic racism. And of course, I would think about that being very palatable information, coming at it from offering, there's actually a 2.5-minute YouTube video that describes structural racism, I think, in a really succinct and valuable way. I think many of us have seen the graphic of the 3 individuals behind the fence at a baseball game where the differentiation between equitable or fairness, treating everyone the same, and equity is just depicted visually. So I think about using those kinds of prompts if people are interested and willing to have a conversation.
Terrific. How do you balance being culturally curious without putting a burden on others to educate you about their culture or background?
That's, again, I would say the awareness implicit or explicit in the question is wonderful. I would say that the only way that we can know if we are not burdening others is, one, to our own self-awareness, and 2, to make our intention not too explicit, to tell people that we want them to let us know if our questions or our seeking to understand ever feels like it is a disproportionate burden. I think we also describe why we're asking our questions. Additionally, we have a responsibility, and I'm going to say particularly as white identified people, not knowing if the asker of the question what their multiple identities are, but I think we have a responsibility to, when we can, seek out our own information, when we can read, when we can explore cultural meanings. It is our responsibility to do so. And at the same time, of course, cultural expressions are going to be so nuanced that it's always richer if the conversation can be one that's had with the consultee. But I think we have a responsibility to know as much information and history and background as possible.
Sounds terrific. So I'm going to give one last question, but before, I just wanted to remind people to please fill out the evaluation in the chat box, and also to encourage people to go back and look at Kadija's other 3 webinars, which are archived on our TTAC.ny.org website. All incredibly rich content and very informative. So we've been very privileged to have her offer us 4 webinars here. So the last question is, I am white and I work with primarily staff of color. Any thoughts about being the white person who wants to talk about race and racism?
Well, I hope, again, I hope that there have been some of my thoughts have been evident in the presentation. But I think similar to the earlier question about perhaps the idea of when in a situation, the idea of introducing the impacts that racism in our country, not in the particular individuals with whom we are working, the ways in which racism exerts itself, that we are in an opportune moment to begin to bring up those conversations. But I recognize the difficulty in feeling as if it is possibly an imposition and an overstepping. And again, I think about actually giving voice to my hesitations as both an explanation and a way of giving people an understanding. So what I would think about is, again, being able to say that because I believe that racism is omnipresent in all of our interactions and institutions, that it might behoove us as a group to begin to think about whether we pay attention to whether that ever shows up in our interactions. So this idea, again, about seeking agreements and permission, I don't see it as problematic to bring up race, and especially I think if we're thinking about intersectionality, and what I mean by that is we have to think about that as a white person and as a mental health consultant, that there are ways in which our position, whether we feel it or not, that our position is often perceived as a position of power. We may be white, we may have more education, we may be perceived as having more authority or power. All of those issues can make it, I think, difficult for providers who feel less powerful or because of race feel less privileged and powerful to possibly bring up the conversation. And so I feel it as a responsibility that the person who has the perceived power in a relationship, whether that's a supervisor and a supervisee, a mental health consultant and consultees, that it is the responsibility of the person with the power to give voice to the possibility of inequities. And then how those inequities get taken up has to, of course, be a co-creation over time.
Kadija, thank you so much. This has really been so rich and so informative, and it's really been a pleasure, and thank you. And these will be our whole webinar, and the PowerPoints will be archived on our website. And if you look in the chat box, you'll also see that this will take 2 to 3 days. But thank you, everyone. Please fill out the evaluation form.
Thank you very much, Evelyn and all, and may you all be safe and well and continue to take up the fight for all of our equalities. Good afternoon. Bye-bye.